In the preceding presentation, we looked at foraging as a way of interacting with an environment. Now let's turn to food production systems. In this presentation, we'll look at the domestication of plants and animals, which brought about the agricultural revolution. Agriculture, which includes both horticulture or shifting cultivation and intensive agriculture. Pastoralism, that is, the raising of livestock. And industrialism, including industrial agriculture and food production. And then we'll also touch briefly at the end on globalization and the environment. Domestication is the human practice of controlling the supply and distribution of selected plants and animals. It arose around 10,000 years ago in the Old World and 4,000 to 5,000 years ago in the New World. Agriculture supports more people per unit of land, and so it allowed population densities to rise higher than they could under foragers. Many farming methods exist, but we can categorize them into horticulture or shifting cultivation, intensive agriculture, and industrial agriculture. First, let's look at horticulture or shifting cultivation. Many people refer to horticulture as slash and burn, which is descriptively accurate in that people usually clear the vegetation from a plot of land and then burn it to release nutrients into the soil and to slow weed growth. But I find this term ethnocentric because slash and burn is used in part to accuse shifting cultivators of degrading their environment. I prefer shifting cultivation, which means that people farm a given plot of land for a time before leaving it fallow or unplanted and clearing a new site. This gives the previous plot time to regenerate. If population density is relatively low, shifting cultivation can be a highly sustainable system. Shifting cultivation does alter the environment more than foraging, but much less so than intensive and industrial agriculture. In any case, horticulturists use only hand tools such as machetes, axes, digging sticks, and hoes to plant, cultivate, and harvest. Horticulture produces more food per unit of land than foraging. It also requires labor investment in a piece of land to clear it, plant, weed, harvest, and so on. This world map shows principal regions where horticulture was practiced in the period of European contact. Note that horticulture was the dominant system of food production in much of eastern North America, as well as in Central Africa, where I have worked. Horticulture had the following cultural impacts. First, the size of settlements increased and people became more sedentary. Second, families established their own claims to particular pieces of land. And third, people could store possessions, raising the potential for wealth accumulation. Let's look at horticulture or shifting cultivation in the Central African country of Gabon, where I've undertaken field research for many years. I want to take you through the sequence of shifting cultivation in the rainforest surrounding this village in northeastern Gabon. As practiced in northeastern Gabon, as elsewhere, the steps in shifting cultivation include clearing the undergrowth, felling the trees, burning the vegetation, planting, weeding, harvesting, and food storage and preparation. Here we see Memvoula clearing a peanut field. Women do most of the work in peanut fields, from clearing to harvesting. In northeastern Gabon, rural cultivators normally clear 3 fields per year: a peanut field and a maize and cassava field in the long dry season from June to September, and a squash and cassava field during the short dry season from December to February. Cassava is a starchy root crop also called manioc. Cassava and plantain bananas are the main food crop in the Gabonese rural diet. In addition to these crops, cultivators also mix in other crops, including leafy greens, other root crops, cherry tomatoes, gumbo, sugarcane, and hot peppers. In season, they also gather fruits and nuts in the rainforest. Men generally clear and fell trees in the two other types of fields before the women take over. Here, Angwa clears a maize manioc field for his wife. Once the undergrowth has had time to dry out, the men fell the trees, smaller trees with a machete and larger trees with an axe. Increasingly, they hire woodcutters to do this work with imported chainsaws. Here we see Honoré standing before a tree he has felled with an axe in his girlfriend's grandmother's field. Once the field is sufficiently dry, it's burned. Burning releases nutrients, especially potassium, into the soil and also slows down weed growth. As you can see here, this field is not burned sufficiently enough, so the people gathered up the unburned underbrush into piles for reburning. Note that the tree stumps are left in the soil. This facilitates eventual regrowth and prevents erosion by holding the soil in place. After the field is burned, the women plant various food crops from cuttings, offshoots, or seeds. After that, they periodically visit the field during growing season to weed it. Weeding is the most tedious part of the agricultural cycle and is done almost entirely by women. Finally comes the harvest. Peanuts, maize, and squash, which is grown for the seeds rather than the flesh, are harvested all at once and need to be dried, transported, and stored, again by the women. Plantains are harvested as they ripen. Manioc, which takes over a year to mature, is left in the ground and harvested throughout the year as needed. Here, a young woman, Mekwie, harvests cherry tomatoes that have been planted in a peanut field. Tomatoes do well here because peanuts fix nitrogen, another essential nutrient, in the soil. Women generally head out to the fields each morning with a machete and an empty basket. When they return home, their basket is usually full. On food they have harvested, manioc that has been soaked in nearby streams as part of its processing, forest leaves used to wrap manioc, or firewood. Here, young women pass through the village on their way home with baskets filled to the brim with firewood. Cassava, or manioc, requires considerable preparation. After it has been soaked to remove toxins in its skin, the women bring it home for further preparation. First they pound it and remove the inedible fibers, then they wrap it in leaves for steaming. Once it has been steamed, it provides a starchy staple that accompanies main dishes of meat, fish, and vegetables, as well as peanut and palm nut stew. Here, Eugenie roasts peanuts taken from the sacks behind her. These will be ground into a paste for peanut soup with smoked fish. Villagers also hunt and trap game in the surrounding forest. In northeastern Gabon, bushmeat provides a main source of animal protein. Here you see two men carrying a Bay Duiker. Duikers are small forest antelopes, and there are several kinds in the Gabonese rainforest. People eat a variety of other species, including porcupines, hornbills, monkeys, scaly anteaters, and others. Game can also be sold to make money. Here you see a passing driver buying small blue duikers. Gabonese villagers also fish in a variety of ways, in rivers, streams, and swamps. Here you see a couple checking their fishing nets early in the morning. They had come out to a village fishing camp about 10 miles from the village. Although this horticultural food production system might strike you as traditional, it has undergone considerable changes through both the world capitalist system and colonialism. Here are just a few examples. Many of the Gabonese staple crops, including maize, groundnuts, and cassava, were introduced from the Americas via the transatlantic trade. In other words, the village agricultural economy is at least in part a product of what scholars call the Atlantic World System, linking Africa, the Americas, and Europe. During the colonial period, cocoa and coffee were introduced as cash crops and also changed the village economy. But in recent years, in part due to Gabon's reliance on oil exports and also on volatile prices for coffee and cocoa in the global marketplace, production of these crops has declined. Oil has also provided the foreign exchange that allows Gabon to import much of its food. Thus, Gabonese villages produce a much smaller portion of the national food supply than in the past. Since 2000, the international logging industry has pushed into northeastern Gabon. Some villagers have gone to work for the logging companies, supply them with food, or have opened shops and bars, but most villagers have not benefited economically. At the same time, the opening of numerous logging roads has made the forest more accessible, particularly to hunting, and thus has a significant environmental impact. Let's touch more briefly on intensive agriculture, in which people use land more intensively. Let's touch more briefly on intensive agriculture, in which people use land more intensively. To produce higher yields, people make investments to maintain or improve the long-term productivity of the soil. Such investments include fertilization, generally with dung or livestock, crop rotation, careful weeding, turning the soil prior to planting, pest management, and composting. Cultural impacts of intensive agriculture include the following. People work the land with the help of plows, fertilizer, and irrigation. Intensive agriculture supports much higher population density and led to the rise of socially and politically complex forms of society and city life. It allowed a single farm family to produce above its own food needs or a surplus. Then this surplus could be sold or was taxed for the use of nobles and other occupational groups who did not produce their own food. Intensive agriculture also led to new social groups in forms of social hierarchy, such as peasants and aristocrats. Compared with horticulture, intensive agriculture is more productive per unit of land. This high productivity is due to factors such as having reduced fallow periods or no fallow at all, preparing the land more thoroughly prior to planting, removing weeds, adding manure and other organic fertilizers, and manipulating the water supply. But making these investments requires a lot of labor and social mechanisms to coordinate the work. This map shows some of the areas where intensive agriculture was practiced beginning about 5,000 years ago. This second world map shows some of the major areas of the world where intensive agriculture contributed to the rise of large-scale political organizations. The Tigris and Euphrates Valley of Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley of Egypt, the Indus Valley of Pakistan, and China. In the New World, we see the large-scale civilizations of the Mayans, Toltecs, and Aztecs of Central America and Mexico, and the Incas of the Andean coast and highlands. Societies that practice intensive agriculture created new individuals and social groups, including nobles and peasants. Peasants are rural food producers who are integrated into a larger society politically and economically. Peasants often have little power, are relatively poor, and are looked down upon